journalists speaking about Brexit in central London right now.
A series at the 11th hour, really, when we're in the eye of the storm, to discuss the major issues ahead of us. And if there's some press here, I'll understand if you walk out, if it's the next resignation or the next wave of negotiation that is always happening as we speak. But I want to talk about something that is putting this debate in what I think is the proper context. We've had a weekend when we'll be discussing whether we'll be a rule taker or rule maker if the temporary deal that is signed is eventually passed by the House of Commons and agreed by the European Union. But I want to suggest that whatever the deal now is, and whether there is a deal or not, the long-term questions are unresolved. Just think of it this way. Over the last 2 years, we have had a series of negotiations. Over the next few years lie ahead a further series of negotiations on the eventual deal between the European Union and the United Kingdom. But as we stand, and in any deal that is published, what our relationship is to the single market is unresolved. What our relationship is to the customs union long term is unresolved. Whether we're going to go the way of Norway in the long term is unresolved, or the way of Canada in the long term is unresolved. Whether we have the power to sign free trade deals without conditions is unresolved. The future of Northern Ireland is unresolved. After 2 years of negotiations, after all the intense publicity, none of the major issues are resolved. We've got, at best, coming our way, a short-term temporary fix in the absence of having a long-term endpoint, a destination, a resting place, whatever you call it, a safe harbour. And we've got a short-term temporary fix coming our way if we have a deal in the absence of a long-term endpoint that is agreed. Indeed, we have a short-term fix ahead of us because the Cabinet and the Government cannot agree what their long-term destination is. And indeed, it's probably worse than that, because the selling point of the short-term temporary fix, if it is actually agreed and then published and then debated in the House of Commons, will be to the hard Brexiteers that still open to them is the option of going the way of a hard Brexit, the way of Canada, and that will be one of the selling points the Prime Minister will use to try to get the deal through. Now, normally in a negotiation, you start by having a long-term objective, and then you see how you can get to it. The British public would be absolutely shocked, and maybe will be in the next few weeks, when they find that after 2 years of negotiation, we have years ahead of negotiation, we have no agreement on the long-term objectives that we're trying to reach, and indeed, there is no possibility of this Cabinet or this Government getting a consensus in its present form on these long-term objectives. If you think of it this way, the decision has been made not to have a decision. The decision is actually indecision. What Churchill said about his party in the 1930s, that they were resolved to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, and all-powerful for impotence, is coming home to us today. No long-term plan to be announced. Everything still open, even if we have a deal. And what we're finding also is that the process itself is defective also. The process, as we can see now, over these last 2 years of making the decision, has been inward-looking. It has been non-inclusive. Very few people have been consulted on the outside in any serious way. It has been partisan because it's been driven, I'm afraid, by internal party considerations. And it's been piecemeal because many of the long-term issues have not been addressed. Because think of it this way, if you cannot have an agreement on a long-term objective, a long-term destination, then you cannot answer the questions about what our long-term economic future is likely to be, what the investment decisions that companies are going to make are going to be. You put at risk the future of the Union because many issues relating to Scotland and the United Kingdom, Wales and the United Kingdom, as well as Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom, are unresolved. Our role in the world is undecided because we cannot say exactly where we're going to be in relation to the European Union in the years to come. And of course, as we found in the Brexit debate, many of the problems raised by Brexit cannot be solved by Brexit because they're related to the social fabric of the United Kingdom and people's sense that they're losing out as a result of not just economic change in this country, but global change as a whole. But what the debate has shown is the worst of British short-termism. You know that we used to say that short-termism bedeviled British industry, and I remember I used to say when I was doing lectures that in the 50s we managed decline, in the 60s we mismanaged decline, and then in the 70s we declined to manage. And you can think of this debate, which is the ultimate in short-termism, because we made a decision to have a referendum as a country without publishing sufficient information about the consequences of a Brexit. We then saw the government rush into Article 50 and decide that they would have a date for withdrawal before they had a plan for doing it. We then found a few weeks ago that we had no deal preparations hardly ever being undertaken and underway. And so we've had the ultimate in short-termism in this debate. And I look back on two instances where we have proven that we can actually do things in a different way. The Macmillan government in the 1950s, if you look at two major documents that were commissioned by Harold Macmillan after he became Prime Minister in 1957 on the future of Britain, the documents that eventually led him to advocate that we join the European Union, these were serious documents that looked at the geopolitical, economic, industrial, financial implications of any change in Britain's status, partly as a result of Suez, partly because the European decision was something that we had to make. A serious document looking in breadth, you can see them in the cabinet papers, at what the future of Britain would be under all sorts of different scenarios. And then, although I make this point not boastfully, then when it came to the euro, we did have 23 separate investigations into all aspects of the euro and what that would mean. And these were hundreds of thousands of words that were published in an open, transparent way, widespread consultation, which eventually led to the decision, but a process of decision-making that was in depth in a way that we have not seen on a far bigger issue than simply the euro. Now we're debating the whole of our relationship with Europe. And so there you have this problem, that it's not just a problem with the decision itself, there's a problem with the process. And I just think about this. This process goes on for several years more. Even if there is a deal in the next few weeks and we leave in March, and that all goes to the plan that the Prime Minister would like to adopt, she has at least 2 more years of negotiation on almost exactly the same issues, single market, customs union, relationship, Norway, Canada, whether we can have free trade agreements with other countries and everything else. Northern Ireland's back on the agenda. And the public will be exposed to the same process of inward-looking decision-making driven by partisan considerations, not inclusive, not open, not allowing the public a way in, a way that might satisfy the very grievances that in some respects brought about Brexit in the first place. People feeling that they are not listened to, that they're not consulted, that there's a Westminster bubble, that they're not brought into these discussions that are held by the elites amongst themselves. And that is going to be the way of the next few years. You know, Einstein, when he said his definition of insanity, I would say inanity rather than insanity, was to do the same thing all over again and expect a different result. That is the prospect we are looking forward to, another 2 years of negotiations with the same issues, government expecting that something may change, and the most likely thing is we end up sitting here 2 years from now, or maybe even longer, looking at exactly the same problems unresolved if nothing changes. And let me just say, before I make my proposals, if nothing changes, then we will be an even more divided Britain. There is no doubt in my mind about that. More divided than during the 3-day week of the 70s, more divided than during the miners' strike of the 80s, more divided than the poll tax disagreements of the early 90s, more divided than over the Iraq War. I think back to history and think of the Corn Law agitation. I think of the Irish question in the 1880s, and you think back to these major internal political agreements in the House of Commons, but also to these massive disagreements within the country in our last 30 years, and I don't think we are as divided then as we are likely to be now, and the effect on the cohesion of our country and the corrosion of trust in our democracy could be absolutely mind-blowing. If you think of the loss of trust in politics over these last few years, 20% didn't trust the government, now 60% don't trust the government. The loss of faith in politicians, 20% didn't trust the Prime Minister, now it's nearly 55% don't trust the Prime Minister. And then you think of the consequences of a long-term breakdown of trust. Well, you see it in other countries. Allegations on all sides of betrayal. That becomes the language of politics. And Remainers who are young say that the old people have let them down by mortgaging the future. Remainers say that the campaign was conducted in a fraudulent way during the referendum, and that's now proven by the Electoral Commission. Leavers say that they were promised all these things would happen the day after Brexit. They'd be better off, the health service would have all this more money, the fishing industry would be free to do what it wants, it would be an easy Brexit, could happen almost overnight. And most of all, Brexiteers thinking, we voted because we wanted to be listened to. We thought that we were striking a blow for a more open discussion with us about what's happening, and now we find we're not being listened to, and none of the Brexit options are satisfactory, as we find in all the opinion polling to the Brexit voters. So the betrayal, or this sense of betrayal that people feel, is corrosive of our democracy and of trust in politics. And if you just think forward, a year from now, 2 years from now, the same debates going on, and the same issues still being fought out, because these are the questions that remain unresolved, the effect on public opinion is something that I hesitate to contemplate. So we have a context now where we don't have agreement on a long-term destination, where we have a breakdown in trust and division within the electorate, where allegations of betrayal create a poisonous and toxic atmosphere in politics and are a fertile ground, I'm afraid, for those kinds of politicians who don't offer solutions or positive solutions, but whose stock in trade, as we find right round the world, the stock in trade is simply to articulate anger on behalf of people without giving any positive way forward. So unless something changes, I believe that we're in for a very difficult period ahead. And I want to suggest how we might do something about it. Our challenge is to reunite a divided country. Our challenge is to see if there's a way to end the deadlock. My sense is that the challenge of reuniting a divided country, and given that we have so many years ahead of this debate, is we have to break out of the Westminster bubble. We have to start listening to the people of this country on issues that concern them, and therefore we have got to find a way of doing so. So think forward the next few weeks. I'm absolutely clear that it would be a travesty of democracy if there was not an open debate in the House of Commons on the deal. I know that the Procedure Committee of the House of Commons is going to recommend that there are 3 options for the debate when it comes back to the House of Commons, the meaningful vote, as it's called. One of them is to hold a vote on the government's proposals first, in which case almost every other potential amendment falls. Surely we've got to argue that the correct way in an open democracy that is outward-looking, that is trying to connect with people, is to allow all views to be heard and to have amendments first before you have the conclusive vote. And one of these amendments must be the opportunity to renegotiate the deal that the government has done if people find that unsatisfactory. There is no reason, in my view, and I'm used to European negotiations. I'm also, by the way, quite used to negotiations with the Ulster Unionists. There is no reason why you cannot go back to Brussels, in my view, and say, this deal is not the one we want, this is another deal. So the alternative in this vote, when it comes to the House of Commons, whenever it comes, is not no deal versus the only deal on the table. It seems to me it is possible to go back and renegotiate. I, for one, have always said that I think there will be a second referendum. I believe that in the end, the situation will have been seen to have changed since 2016, and that the people should, in the end, have the final say. But I also believe that we have got to find a far better way of listening and hearing the voices of people. So what I want to suggest is we have a new kind of Royal Commission, a Royal Commission of a very different type from the usual great and the good, sitting there pontificating, as you might say, as Harold Wilson said, taking minutes and spending years. We need a new kind of commission, one that is a commission that is charged with hearing the voices of the British people, going out into the regions and into the nations of the United Kingdom, raising with people in deliberative hearings and consultative exercises the questions that they have about migration, sovereignty, about the long-term economic future of the country, seeing, I suppose I'm saying, if we can find a way that a consensus is possible on a key set of issues that appear to divide people fundamentally at the moment, but in my view are capable of being resolved if we have an honest and full and indeed comprehensive debate on in these issues. And the aim of such an exercise, because we have these years ahead of us, is not to think short term that we need a fix or we'll have to have a fix tomorrow. Is to say, how can we engage the country in a dialogue, in a conversation about the key issues that matter, listen to the voices that are coming from both sides of industry. I do not think the government has been listening to either side of industry in the way that it should during this debate, but also the voices of the regions and the nations. Now, what then are the long-term issues that have got to be resolved and have got to be part of this debate? I think on the table has got to be our long-term economic future. I don't think, in a strange way, that despite 2 years of negotiations and 2 years of debate, it has been on the table. Take the car industry as one example. It is true that if there are tariffs and customs duties, then the car industry faces an enormous problem. 10% tariff, selling exports, 4.5% with imports, 4.5 billion costs. It is also true that if you have no customs union, you have the friction when parts and components are going back and forward. The mini crankshaft alone goes back and forward 4 times before it is sold on to someone, probably and usually someone in continental Europe. So you have this problem of friction. But you have an even bigger problem that we've got to address, which symbolizes the problem that we've got to address about our long-term economic future that doesn't seem to be as part of the debate as it should be. We produce about 1.7 million cars a year. 1.3 million of them are exported. We actually export 1.6 million cars, so engines. So 80% of our cars and more of our engines are actually exported from Britain. The car industry in Britain, which was built up in the last 30 and 40 years with mainly foreign owners, depends on an export trade that is 80% of what it produces. The home market does not cover the production of the car industry. But every car company in Britain at the moment is making a decision very soon about their long-term investment. They're moving from diesel to non-diesel cars, of course, but they're also moving into electric cars, and they're also, of course, moving into driverless cars. And that new technology dominates the investment decisions that these car companies are going to make, and they have a choice. If they're exporting to mainland Europe, and 80% of their cars are exports, more than half of them to the European Union countries itself, then they are faced with a choice. Do they build their cars and their engines in mainland Europe, where the market fundamentally is biggest, or do they make the decision in Britain? And these long-term investment decisions have got to be made in the context of what is going to happen to the British economy. What is our relationship long-term going to be with Europe? What is it going to be to the customs union, the single market? And none of these issues at the moment are resolved. We have to debate these issues. Trade. Everybody knows that trade with China and India and Australia, New Zealand and America and so is important. But when you actually look at the figures, 1% of our trade is with India, 1% with sub-Saharan Africa, 1% with Australia, less than 1% with New Zealand, 1% or so with Canada, 4 or 5% with China. The vast majority of our trade is with mainland Europe, and we have got to have answers, and the people will understand if we put that question that there are answers that have to be found. I'll give you one other example. The European Investment Bank invests 10 billion in Britain since 2010. That's a European investment bank run by the countries of the European Union. Infrastructure investment in Britain has depended on that for the last 20 or 30 years. Britain is a shareholder. Leave the European Union in March, we have to leave the European Investment Bank. We have no other arrangement yet being proposed, but we know that we're going to be forced out of the European Investment Bank, that they will not accept it. But we should be thinking now about a partnership with the European Investment Bank if we leave, or certainly what we do on these big issues. So our economic future, and I give only these 3 examples, has got to be part of this debate. The future of our union has got to be part of this debate. There are 2 major problems that arise, and I don't think it's properly appreciated in London, from the devolution settlement and what happens if we leave the European Union. The first is that because of the devolution settlement, which said that all powers are transferred to Scotland and Wales unless specifically not transferred, then there should have been an automatic transfer of powers over agriculture and fisheries, regional policies, some aspects of state aids and so on and so forth, from Brussels through London, but to Edinburgh, to Belfast and to Cardiff. But the government decided in their wisdom that they would hold these powers in Westminster for seven years, or up to seven years. And they decided to defy the devolution settlement by saying that aspects of the UK single market overrode that, despite the fact that the legislation previously has said otherwise. And that is an issue that is unresolved. But unresolved also for Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and for the regions, is access to Europe, access to markets. So we leave the European Union. In the 2014 referendum, what we said was that Scotland should stay part of the United Kingdom, and this is a very strong argument because our influence in the world depends on the combined weight of Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England in international councils, through the United Kingdom being a powerful force in the G7, the G20, the United Nations and NATO and everything else. But of course, what Scottish nationalists are saying is that they were promised that there would be access to Europe, and that while our international efforts were through the United Kingdom, they were always as part of the European Union as well. And nobody has come up with a way, although I think there is a way, and I could suggest it, of allowing this question to be solved, that if you promise that you will have access through the United Kingdom to the international community, and then you cut yourself off from the European Union against the will of the Scottish people in particular, I'm talking about here, what do you then do about it? But it raises fundamental questions about the future of the Union, which are a risk to the Union and will become clear over the next 2 years as these debates keep going on and on. Third issue that we've got to be clear about, our influence in the world. Now, since Churchill, we've talked about 3 concentric circles of influence, so that Britain has got influence in the world through our relationship with the Commonwealth, through our relationship with America, through our relationship with Europe. The European Union, of course, was the later relationship that was formulated in the 60s and 70s, and we finally joined in 75. But of course, the point of 3 circles of influence, these concentric circles, was Churchill's view and others' view that the more influence we had in Europe, the more influence we would have in Washington. The more influence we had in Washington, the more influence we'd have in Brussels, in Bonn, and Berlin, and in Paris. Now, part of that equation is no longer true, because if we were to leave the European Union, then we lose influence in Europe, and we have to ask, what does that mean for our role in the world? And what debate is actually taking place on that at the moment that can solve some of these problems? I, for one, think that we should be thinking of this 4th concentric circle of influence, and that is our role in international institutions. And if Britain had influence in the United Nations more than it has at the moment, and we've always been afraid of the United Nations as a colonial power because they would actually tell us what to do about the remaining dependent territories and colonies, if we had more influence in the World Bank, in the International Monetary Fund, the World that would make a difference. But no government paper, no recommendation, nothing has come that suggests that there is any thinking going on about this. And finally, long-term issue, the health of the social fabric. We know perfectly well that many of the reasons that people voted for Brexit was nothing to do with Brexit itself. It was their frustration at the way economic change is hitting their communities, hitting the industrial towns, hitting the manufacturing centres, hitting the regions that we know are incredibly important to the future of our country, particularly of manufacturing. And the discontent that people felt was reflected in wanting to be listened to in one way, and this was a chance for people to want to listen to them. But you know, the social fabric in our country is breaking down. It was based on 4 pillars. One, that if you worked hard, you'd get a decent wage. The second was there was a ladder of opportunity and therefore upward mobility for people who strove and had ambition. Thirdly, that top pay was related to merit and effort and contribution to the community. Fourthly, that there was a minimum below which people should never fall, either in the provision of, both in the provision of public services and in terms of income. Now, all 4 of these pillars are breaking apart. Wages are not big enough for millions of people to escape poverty. And there are now 4 million, and it's rising to 5 million children in poverty, mainly in working families. Upward mobility is far more restricted now.
The former Prime Minister
sadly,
Gordon Brown speaking in central London on his concerns around what is happening with the Brexit debate and where he thinks things need to go going forward. In terms of his concerns looking backwards, he said that the debate has been the ultimate in short-termism. The country has rushed into a situation, rushed into the Article 50 date for withdrawal before there was a clear plan. He said it's all about short-term temporary fixes, and there is no agreement on what the long-term destination is. He compared the situation with a future relationship with the EU over what happened when consideration was given to joining the euro, and he spoke then about 23 separate investigations were carried out then into what that would mean. It was a process of in-depth decision, and that has just not been the case, he was saying, with the EU relationship, and he spoke of his fears.